I welcome you to the ping pong of nήσος. Here we discuss, where we discuss different subjects of social sciences. This is the first episode in English, and we are doing this episode in English because our guest, who is sitting next to me, is Eduardo Kandava. Eduardo, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Eduardo Kandava is professor of American literature and the holder of Philip Mayhew, if I said it correctly, at the Princeton University. If I'll try to give you a good image of the works and interests of him, I think I will speak endlessly. So instead of that, I'll just mention two of his last activities. First, his last book, Politically Read, co-authored with Sarah Nadal Melciot, a book that was published in 2023. Second, at the end of the previous year, 2025, he gave the 18th annual lecture in memory of Nikos Pouladjas here in Athens for the Nikos Pouladjas Institute. The title was Teaching History to Read, Fazal Sheikh's Erasure Trilogy. You can find the lecture on YouTube, and I think that the Greek translation of it will be published by nήσος in the upcoming months, I think. The discussion that we will have today is about the political dimensions of photography nowadays. And for our discussion, I will take as a point of departure the book of yours, Words of Light, Thesis on Photography of History, translated by Manolis Athanasakis and published by nήσος. So, to begin with, you write in your prologue that this book has been written in the name of a resistance to the illiteracy of photography. But maybe nowadays it seems a little bit paradoxical, because as you have said some years ago, today we are homines photographiski, I think. Yeah. So how can we be illiterate in something that we do all the time?
Okay, this is a very good question, because it's often the things that one is most actively engaged in that one knows the least. It's true. First of all, thank you for being here and for the invitation from nήσος. It's always nice to be in this space. And you may monitor me, interrupt me, so because as everyone in this room knows, when I get started, I can threaten to go on forever, like a river. So let me just say that this question of the insistence that we need to resist literacy, I mean the illiteracy in relation to images, is something that comes from, at least initially, a statement from Moholy-Nagy in 1927, when he predicts that the illiteracy of the future will be not of reading and writing, but of photography. So that already in the late 20s, he had a sense that the sort of what Krakauer would call the blizzard of photos, the flood of photos that everyone was surrounded with in magazines, newsreels at that time, had to be thought about. Because what he was worried about and what other people were worried about was the role and place of images in our everyday life and the way in which they could be moved to basically move the masses in this or that direction. So it becomes a question of how you engage, how you understand, how you think about the history of the movement of images within a certain particular, let's say, political formation, society, etc. So I was interested in him saying that the illiteracy of the future would be of photography. And so much of my work over the last, I don't know, at least 20 years has been trying to develop a series of strategies, models for training people how to read images historically and especially in moments of danger. And I think we live in a moment of danger, and many of the people that I read were also writing in moments of danger, Benjamin, Krakauer, etc. So there's a kind of necessity and urgency in being able to read images. I mean, if you think of what you're saying, we live in the midst of images, the proliferation of images. The essay that I referred to a little minute ago by Krakauer in 1927, again, at the same year that Moholy-Nagy says what he says, is an essay called Photography. And in there he says, we have never lived in a world that has known so much about itself if knowing about itself means having an image of everything. Right? And so he's talking, in fact, about the production and proliferation of images. But then he says that because we're so bombarded by all these images, we don't have time to really think about them, reflect upon them, to think about the history that is sealed in every image, and actually to track the way in which these images are making history, are producing history, in the way in which they move people, persuade people to go this direction and that one. So, but by the end of this paragraph, he says, but we have never lived in a world that has known so little about itself, precisely because these images, in their proliferation, produce a strike against understanding. There's so many images, we're so bombarded that we don't have time to read them. So this urgency, and if you think about today, these last 20 years that I've been thinking about images, you have images everywhere, as you're suggesting, not just the cameras, the cell phones, but medical imaging, surveillance, cameras in warheads. So it becomes all the more important to think about not just the mobilization of images within the political domain, but also the way in which images can be used in different directions. Yeah. And I think the only way in which then one can protect oneself from being instrumentalized by the mobilization of these images is to learn how to read images. And I agree with you that in some way, this is something that we all do. We are all taking images. The trope is that especially young people, they're very savvy about images because they're taking images, or they're dealing with images, they're saturated with images. Young people don't know how to read images. Yeah. They don't know how to contextualize them. They don't know how to read them. They don't have patience. They can send images everywhere, but they don't think about what they're doing when they send these images. So I've been involved in different projects that are aimed at getting people to think about what they're doing when they're even sending images to different people. So a lot of for me, the stakes of insisting that we need to gain a literacy with images is first of all there because of the proliferation of images. We have to be able to learn to read images and think about them. But we also, it's the only way in a world in which we are being mobilized and moved by the images that are surrounding us, the only way to protect ourselves from being ourselves instrumentalized. So that if you think of Benjamin's work of art essay, for example, I read that essay as an essay that is itself a training manual on how to read images historically in moments of danger. And what he's doing is he's scanning the landscape. He's seeing the way in which National Socialism is mobilizing the technical media, film, radio, photography, and even artworks, etc., mobilizing the technical media in order to give the masses a series of images in which they can see themselves as if they were looking in a mirror. And so Benjamin is very cautious. That's one of the reasons he thinks we have to put the image at the heart of any deconstruction of modernity, because the image is what is moving people. Like language, right? And this is why he says that one of the best places to find the dialectical image is in fact in language. So a lot of my work is also to think about the relationship between language and images, because I think that we are moved. You can't think the political domain now without thinking about language and images. And it doesn't mean that everything is reducible to language and images, wars, poverty, killing, murders, whatever. But these things wouldn't happen without language or images, right? You would never go to war without language, which is to say you need directives, commands, arguments put forward to persuade people to die for a cause. And you can see the sort of spectacle of imagery and the political theater at work, even in the present administration in the United States, right? It's all about the production of images. Yeah. So because of that, it becomes increasingly important to gain a literacy on images. Yeah, I think, yes.
Your answer has just challenged me, because When you talked, I was thought about a famous motif by Zizek and Sloterdijk. They know what they do, but they still do it.
Right.
And I think that from your answer, it's quite the opposite. I think that they don't understand exactly what they see.
I think I mean, I'll even go a little further and make it a little, I would say they know and don't know at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is to say they know in the way they know. They gain a kind of confidence because whatever knowledge they have, whatever interpretation they have is totally mediated by everything that has composed their eyes. So they're seeing things through the mediation of their social networks, what education they've had, what reading they have, what relations they have. All of those things help compose what is possible for someone to see. At the same time, it's almost impossible to reconstruct that network of mediation, right? There's sort of this network of unforeseeably mediated relations that help determine what one does, right? So that Emerson says at one point that 'tis fine to say we elect our course as long as we accept an irresistible dictation, right? So that you act at the same time that you're acted upon, right? So you know at the same time that you're acted upon things that because they're beyond you, larger than you, moving through you, prevent you from knowing at the same time. You can't be, let's say, conscious intentionally to what is motivating you at any given moment.
And you're not historically conscious, I think.
It's impossible to be totally historically conscious, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are lots of, now I'll take a little detour. Breton's Mad Love, which is all organized around why he falls in love in a cafe with this scandalously beautiful woman in 1934. So he tries to reconstruct what could have motivated him, what could have driven him there. So the book begins with a scene of these 7 or so young boys dressed in black, sitting down, looking forward, across which are 7 or so girls looking at the boys, again, forward, not at each other. And basically what he's doing is he's staging theatrically the history of all of his love relationships. And so that if he wants to understand why he falls in love with this girl. I mean, one of the things he would have to do, among others, because he says many other things in these beginning pages, is reconstruct the entirety of his sexual life, right? In other words, is his encounter there a question of necessity or of chance? Or does he fall in love with her because of necessity or chance? And of course, it's going to be both. It's both necessity, both chance, but the extent to which it's necessity requires him reconstructing basically the entirety of his psychic history, right? Everything he read, so he has pages of things he's reading and so on. So that it's an example of somebody who acts, but doesn't act away from not just the history that has made him who he is, not just the unconscious that he has, but it's to say that you can never be present to the entirety of your consciousness. So as you said, you can't be present to the entirety of the historical circumstance in which you're acting. One thing I very often ask my students is try to imagine what a politics would look like if it were based on the model of tears. And they look at me just like you did. And I always say, when you act politically, you look at a situation, you evaluate it, and on the basis of that evaluation, you decide which way to go.
Yeah.
So acting politically is generally based on a model of vision. You look, you evaluate, you act. If you have tears in your eyes, you can't see clearly, right? So politics based on the model of tears is a politics that begins in the presupposition that you always act without seeing things clearly. And when you're seeing someone cry, you're seeing somebody melt. So it also requires a reconceptualization of the political subject as a subject that is fluid, changing, in transition, never the same from one moment to the next. So that a politics based on the model of tears says we always act without knowing what we're doing, and we always act with tears in our eyes.
Yeah.
So, but it also requires this reconceptualization of the political subject, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. There are many thoughts in my mind right now. I thought of Benjamin that said that he said that is like a man that he tries to walk through the midst or between awaken and
Yes.
yeah,
And
something
sleeping.
like
Yeah,
that.
the waking and sleeping. I mean, this is because in some way, I mean, he's doing this from a reading of Proust, right? Who's the classic scene in Proust is him waking up in a bedroom and freaking out because he doesn't know where he is. And so this is the moment between waking and sleeping that becomes the signature of modernity and the modern subject, right? That you are only awake to the extent that you're also asleep at the same time, right?
Yeah.
So you see and don't see at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is to say you know and don't know at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that we can move on now to the next subject, or not exactly the next, but it is clear that the moving images, the cinema, can tell a story. But it's not the same with photography or with a still image. An image is a whole world, but without a text or without a standard context. So, what is the language of photography? You said many things right now. You have said it, and how it tells a story.
Okay, that's a huge question.
Yeah.
I mean, the one thing I would say is that if you're thinking of analog film was already photogrammatically based, right? It was 24 still images going through the movie projector every second, and this produces the illusion of movement by these still images. So there was already from the beginning a relation between still images and moving images. In fact, moving images were based on still images. So this is interesting to me, and so one of the things that I've done and thought about is the way in which that, let's say, distinction between still and moving doesn't stay for me. Not just because the moving image was photogrammatically based from the beginning, and we can talk later maybe about analog, digital, etc. But the still image itself has movement within it, which is to say, movement that is activated with our engagement with the image, right? So that if you, for example, we have a portrait of you, and we say, "Oh, this is you," and I would say, "Okay, it's you, but it's also not just you, because when you're looking at a portrait of you, what you're really looking at is an archive of all the faces that have gone into the making of you." So that in some way you're looking at a flat surface, but what you're looking at is a surface that bears within it an entire network of historical relations. Right? And so that when you're reading an image, one of the things you have to do, aside from, reconstructing that network, identifying who's in the picture, all the history that is sealed in the surface but remains invisible in the surface, but nevertheless has left its traces there. You have to learn how to read, excavate, and so on. And when you read and excavate, you mobilize the image. In other words, that image doesn't stay in a single location. It doesn't stay in a single place. And in fact, I would say that what makes an image, and what has always made an image, is its incapacity to stay a single thing, and its incapacity to stay in a single place. So there's always an itinerancy, a movement that has belonged to the history of photography within even the still image. But I do think that it's something that has to be, you can register it most directly in the way in which you activate that movement through the interpretation of the image. Because you said that you have an image, it doesn't have a caption, what the hell does one do with it? The first thing you do is, this is how you read an image. You contextualize it, But then you pay attention to exactly what you said, which is that every image decontextualizes something, right? It rips something out of a context. So you just have the image, it doesn't have a context. So you have to reconstruct the context, but you also have to pay attention to that force of decontextualization. And you need to do both of these things, which are not easy to do simultaneously. But when you try and do that, there's even an oscillation and movement between that activity of contextualizing and decontextualizing. So for me, no image can stay in a single place. No image can be read in isolation. Every image requires language to be attached to it in order to be read. But often that language is sort of sealed within and given to us by the image itself. So which is to say that the image can, if read properly, teach us how to read it, right? So I think I think that one can no longer really talk about the distinction between still and moving images, because I think it was already an anachronistic way of talking about that relationship from the very beginning, precisely because film was based on still images.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense. But
Yeah.
I mean, you could be saying, but they're still images, and okay, you're activating in your head, but they're still images. I'm saying that this would be a misreading of that image, that the image is only what it is because it has that capacity to move.
Yeah.
Which we see, right? The photographs circulate before us, around us. I mean, it's like a name, right? A name only works if it can function in your absence, right? It's the same with a photograph. I mean, even in our lifetime, photographs of us circulate in the world without us, already anticipating the moment when we won't be there.
Yeah, and this video will circulate without us.
Yes, exactly. But this is why one of the experiences par excellence of the photograph is an activity of mourning, right? When you have a photograph in your hand, that's the best evidence that what you have in your hand is not what was photographed. So the photograph exists in relation to the absence of the photographed, right? So that that's why the experience of mournfulness is one of the experiences of looking at photographs. But it's structured like a name. I mean, because a name can only function, it can only be a name if it can function even in the absence of the one who's named.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's not a name.
It's like a river. You said that.
It's true. It's true. We just hope it won't become a flood. So, okay.
Somewhere Benjamin says...
The waters are rising.
Yeah.
Yes.
Somewhere Benjamin says that there is a kind of transmission that is a catastrophe. So I want from you to say something about the political mobilization of photography, and from the one hand, this mobilization can be of a catastrophic form, as Benjamin said, and in which way can the emancipatory dimensions, if there are any, I think there are, of the medium can merge?
Okay, this is a totally complicated question. Let me think. So when Benjamin says that there are certain transmissions that are themselves catastrophic, he means a number of things, I think. He means not simply that there are transmissions that convey catastrophic events, convey data, news, information about catastrophic events. He means also transmissions themselves that are catastrophic, right? And so it's in the context, among other things, because Benjamin is, despite what some people think, one of the great readers of Marx. One of the ways in which transmission can be catastrophic is that transmission, which is a question of inheritance, a question of legacy, a question of what is handed down, can be catastrophic precisely because what is being transmitted is, let's say, the catastrophic forms of capital. You know, this is what we inherit. So this is a transmission that is absolutely catastrophic because, as he says, the beginnings of capital had to do with violence, expropriation, extraction, etc., plunder, slaughter, and so on. So that inheritance, which is itself a kind of transmission, is catastrophic. Right? So it's something. It's not just that something catastrophic is being transmitted, although that's part of it, but that the transmission itself is catastrophic because it's transmitting something that catastrophic carries over, producing further catastrophes. So because his obsession with transmission is often linked to his thought of technology, and because Benjamin actually thinks there can be no thought of the political that is not at the same time a thought of the technological, especially given the time in which he's living. You have to be able to engage technology without ever knowing that your engagement is going to be emancipatory or repressive. And this is a structural issue for him. And it has to do with transmission, it has to do with inheritance, because we don't use a language that is just ours, right? Because we inherit the language we use, we don't have full control of everything that is in that language. Right? So that when we act and use that language, things can come through it, can be transmitted through it that we didn't intend. So because of that, what he says is that there is always a danger that without our knowing it, we will become tools or instruments of the oppressors. Right? And he has a very technical term for this. This is what he calls danger. Danger is the always possible, the always present possibility that without your knowing it, you can reinforce the very thing you're going against. Right? So if he thinks that you can't think politics without technology at this particular moment, as he sees, for example, National Socialism instrumentalizing the technical media, how do you combat that? Right? If technology is everywhere, if Junger is correct that technology names an absolute space of danger, because technology can lead to commodification, homogenization, technologization, violence, instrumentalization, all these things. How do you inhabit the technological space in a way that can interrupt that? So this goes back to this transmission that is catastrophic, because what Benjamin says in a related passage is that the only way in which phenomena can be rescued is if things are fissured, like if things are interrupted, if things are broken. This is the only chance for something to emerge, right? If that, what he calls the homogeneous continuity and linearity of time is interrupted. So he wants catastrophe, a different kind of catastrophe, because in some sense, what he'll say is the real catastrophe, he says, is the fact that things always go on in the same way that they've always gone on forever. This is a catastrophe. But what he wants is a catastrophe of that catastrophe. And that's the only way you can rescue phenomena from the ruination that has been produced by capital. You know, you go and look for the fissures, the cracks, the shards, the ruins, and on the basis of that, you try and reconfigure everything. So if you think about that phrase, the transmission that is a catastrophe, he's talking about a transmission that is catastrophic because it carries over, it transmits the violence of capital. But in the long run, you inhabit that space and do what you can to invent, create, enact a catastrophe against that catastrophe. Right? Because in the same way that you have to use technology against technology, you have to use a catastrophe against catastrophe. But when you put it that way, then what you realize is that you have to use always the very thing you're going against. And that's why you always run the risk of, without your knowing it, reinforcing what you are trying to go against. It's a structural issue. But it's a structural issue also because there is no reform without that risk. You always have to inhabit the very thing you want to go against. You can't be on the outside of it. It's not that you can criticize capital from outside of capital, right? And in fact, if you imagine that, that's when capital is going to take you from behind. You know, there's no escape, right? So there's no safety zone, which is why it's a zone of danger. But this transmission that is catastrophic, you have to find in the fissures, in the cracks, in the shards and ruins of history, these openings these crags that you can step on and try and move things in another direction. It's not easy. There's just one example, and then I'll shut the spout of the river for a minute, is that Benjamin has the very famous image of the dialectician who's trying to set the sail in a certain way so that he can take advantage of the winds of world history. Right? Now, just think of the image, right? He's on a boat, the wind is blowing, he's trying to set the sail, the wind is blowing, the boat is rocking on the water. The chances that he can align that thing in the right angle, at the right moment, are very small and very fleeting, right? So when that happens, he better be fucking ready, right? And the only way to be ready is to have undergone a kind of training, right? I mean, so that you know at a certain moment, that's a crack, that's a fissure, I'm going to go and I'm going to try and open it up. Right? Yeah. And if you think about it, like think of an example, 2020, all the demonstrations around the globe around the murder of George Floyd. When you think of what could have aligned itself in that moment when he's trying to set the sail and take the advantage of the winds of world history, you had the rage against Trump. You had the murder of Floyd. You had the Black Lives Matter movement. You had the pandemic. You had communal despair. And out of that communal despair, something happened, right? That was absolutely unprogrammed, unpredictable. And this is really important for Benjamin. Benjamin, at one point, cites Marx saying, it's a letter that Marx writes to Beasley in the late 1860s, anyone who tries to draft programs for the future is a reactionary. Because what makes the future is its absolute unpredictability. You can't program the future. All you can do is try and insert yourself into this moving thing and try and stick a lever in it and dislocate it from inside. But again, you have to be ready. There's never a guarantee you're going to get what you want. And this is why this question of whether the mobilization of technology can be used for emancipatory things or for conservative things is a structural problem. You can't predict or know in advance that doing this is going to get you what you want. So the only thing, you have to make a calculation, and you have to go through this calculation which you think, doing this instead of this gives me a better chance of getting this instead of this, but you don't know. Because again, when you take that act, you're being moved by things that are larger than you, that you don't have full control over. So this is why that transmission is always catastrophic, because it shatters things, it breaks things. And so one has to learn how to break the thing that is breaking us in some way, if that makes sense.
Oh, it totally makes sense.
Okay. And you can explain it to me. No.
Yes. Somewhere in your book, The Light of this,
Words of Light.
The Words of Light.
Yes.
Thank you. You said that the images are not belong in the domain of truth.
Okay.
So my question would be, what is the relationship between the images, or the photography, if you like, and the truth? And if photography is only, from photography we can have only another point of view, and just another perception of reality. Yeah.
Okay, that's a big question. These are all big
And
questions.
the other were big questions. I think.
They're all big questions, yes. We like big questions, but we could also tolerate a few small ones too. No, but no. So look, I mean, this is totally interesting if you think of the people that I've already evoked, like Krakauer, Benjamin, etc. Because what they understand is, or what they believe is that there's always a discrepancy between the photograph and what is photographed, right? There's a discrepancy, which is why he says, at a certain point, Krakauer says that having a photograph in your hand does not mean that you have the world in your hand, right? Because there's this question of the relationship between what is being represented and the representation. This is an old philosophical question, right? But people have assumed all along, always from the beginning, that except for Benjamin, who reads that history, that the photograph is a document, it's a record, it shows what was before the camera, right? I mean, so there's this sense that photographs have a particular relation to truth, or at least to the facticity of what was before. As Barthes says in Carmelus, although it's much more complicated, but he says at one point that what the photograph tells you is that was there, right? It's evidentiary. It shows you that was there. Okay. This is a question that is totally intensified now because of the manipulation of photographs with Photoshop, etc. I have a friend who did an exhibition at the Met called Faking It, which was on the history of the manipulation of photographs before Photoshop. Because, of course, you could always manipulate an image in the darkroom, right? So it's not that the image is always a proper representation of what was before the camera. In those days when you're developing the photograph in the darkroom, you could always manipulate, you always create something, it's after the fact, there's not a natural link to that moment. And in fact, one could argue, and Derrida argues this in his book on Jean-François Bonhomme's Photographs of Athens, that no matter how quick the click of the finger is and the shutter of the camera is, there's always a delay. Even if it's a millisecond. And that delay means that whatever is captured isn't identical to what was before the camera. And then in fact, at the very moment which you're clicking, that thing is already transforming into something else, right? So the whole question of the truthfulness of photography hinges on the possibility of, let's say, matching a photograph with what's before the camera. But that relationship between the representation and the referent is extremely complicated, as I said, even in the instance of the portrait of you, right? You look at the portrait and you say, that's you. And I'll say, no, that's not you. That's a photograph of you. And it's not just a photograph of you, but it's a photograph of all the faces that have gone into the making of you. In other words, the photograph bears within it this entire network of historical relations and traces that have left their traces in that flat surface, but are invisible, right? So there's a way in which the fact or truthfulness of a photograph is something to be read, right? It's something that is not, it's not a given that what you're looking at is that. So for example, there's I can give you lots of examples. Which one do I want to pick? It's how do you, so when Benjamin is talking about early photography, what he loves about early photography is the mistiness and ghostly and fuzziness of the early photographs, right? Because those photographs are for him more faithful to the nature of the photograph. Because these are photographs that basically tell you a photograph doesn't give you exactly what was before the camera, right? So he says that as the technology of the camera got better, as the camera was more quickly able to take an image, as the camera, let's say, increasingly came to suggest to us that it was giving you what was in front of it, he sees this as a fall. He sees this as a decline. because it's moving the technology away from what that technology really does, which is not give you what's there, right? Because that surface, that flat surface, doesn't give you anything, really. You have to, again, reconstruct the context, read the force of decontextualization. There's a labor involved in trying to read what that photograph gives you. This is important because it's not simply a question of saying, oh, that's what this is. Because we can put a caption, but those captions can change too. So for example, the very famous image during the Vietnam era by Eddie Adams of this guy shooting the Viet Cong, which became mobilized during the Vietnam anti-war movement and became a very powerful argument against the war. After 9/11, that same image is reproduced in the Los Angeles Times, and basically the narrative around it, they use that image as an argument for executing terrorists, right? So it's the same image, but a different caption, right? So that image by itself doesn't have a relation to truth, let's say. It has to be read, contextualized, language has to be put around it. And when you do that, there's never a guarantee that that language is giving you what was in the image. So Ariel Azoulay, the theorist of photography, Israeli, has gone into Israeli archives, Israeli photographs, archives of photographs, and has recaptioned the captions that the Israeli archivists have put on these images, and basically shown that some of these captions basically describe the exact opposite of what those photographs show, right? So the truth or fiction of a photograph depends on a whole set of apparatuses, discourses, captions, narratives. I guess I didn't answer the question of how a photograph tells a story, but this is in some way how a photograph tells a story. Because you have to reconstruct that story in all of the photograph's muteness, right? The photograph is mute, but its muteness speaks, and its muteness speaks when we read it, right? Yeah. I don't know if this is, it's a way of saying, one shouldn't assume there's a relationship between the photograph and truth, even though this is, of course, part of the long history of the discourse. That relationship has been shattered, let's say, in the advent of the digital photograph, AI, all these ways in which the manipulation of the photograph is now taken for granted. But that manipulation I'm suggesting was always possible. So what you have now is just the intense acceleration of a process that was always possible, right? So it's not that it's a different structure, it's just that there's an acceleration. We can more quickly do what they always did in the darkroom.
Yeah.
And this is important because for Benjamin, if he's analyzing the way in which the Nazi regime is mobilizing images in the technical media, and Leni Riefenstahl is doing the Triumph of the Will. And so when he's showing the way in which they're trying to give the masses a series of images in which they can see themselves in order to move them in this direction instead of that one, what he's saying is these images are presenting themselves as truthful representations. And that we have to understand that there's not a guarantee that that image has this strict, fixed relation to truth. And that if we don't understand that, we're more likely to be seduced into moving in the direction that we don't want to go in.
Oh, I said you have said many things about the next topic, which I has in my mind, which was for the, let's speak schematically, for the three different epochs of photography. We go from the materiality, the analog of photography, to the digital, and then to, let's say, to the
post-digital or
the AI-generated photography. And my question was how these transformations have changed the subject that experienced these transformations. I think you have already said some things, but if you want
I can say more.
But if you want to say more, yeah.
So, I mean, Benjamin says in the Work of Art essay that perception is historical matter. And one of the things he says is that one of the things he's suggesting is that as technologies of perception change, what we're able to see and perceive changes, right? So that as the technologies alter, our perception alters, right? So the perception itself is a historical matter. What we're able to see at any given moment changes in accordance with the advances in technology. So we can do MRIs, we can do CAT scans, we can do surgeries that require, laser cameras and lasers and whatever. So this allows us to perceive things that we weren't able to perceive in the past, right? If you think of the discourse of that transition from analog to digital to post-digital or AI, it's always about the death of photography. If you think of the history of the discourse of photography, photography has always been associated with death for the reason that I said, that when you have a photograph, it's not who was photographed, what was photographed, so it exists in relation to the absence of the photograph. So there's always a presumption that a photograph marks the absence of what was photographed. But it's also, that's why the site of the photograph is always a site of ghosts and phantoms, because it's a return of what was no longer there. But putting that aside, let's say that you have the discourse of photography being associated with death. So if you want to talk about the death of photography, you better be talking about the death of photography, in which case you would be talking about photography's survival, right? So for me, it's not that the digital and the AI and so on mark the death of photography, but instead what you see is the intensification and acceleration again of the kinds of questions raised by photography. In other words, for me, photography is a technology, but it's also for me always been a lever that I can use to open up a whole series of philosophical questions, right? Thinking about photography allows me to think about the relationship between, light and darkness, presence and absence, life and death, memory and forgetting, death and survival. I mean, all sorts of things that are philosophical questions. This is my interest in thinking about photography in some way. Those philosophical questions are exactly the same questions in digital and AI, right? Truth, fiction, same questions. So there is a difference between chemicals, let's say, and data or information, or algorithms. There's differences in those things. But the philosophical questions that are raised by each moment in the history of the medium or in the history of these movements and transformed technologies are absolutely the same. So my argument is that we need pre-digital modes of reading to read post-digital things. And in fact, to think to make an opposition between analog and digital is a naive distinction, because there's no real distinction in terms of the kinds of philosophical questions. I mean, again, there's a difference between chemicals and information data and algorithms, yes. But in terms of the questions raised, they're absolutely the same questions.
Yeah.
I mean, in each instance, you're talking about the truth and falsity of an image, the relationship between the representation and what it's supposed to represent, the memory, forgetting, everything is the same. The questions are the same. So for me, we need to, it's not just that let's say on the one hand, in an ideal world, we would be able to match the speed of these transformations. It's that what I think is required is just a slowing down of the reading. We don't need just a slow food movement. We need a slow reading movement. And this slow reading is we need pre-digital modes of reading to read post-digital phenomena.
Yeah. And I would guess that the same goes for writing and reading in the age of AI. Yeah. Yeah, exactly the same.
In what were you thinking?
I'm thinking about all the discussion about the AI-generated texts
Right.
in the academy, or
I mean, this is interesting because, you know, I mean,
if they pose
there are
any
discussions. There are
philosophical
discussions.
questions.
Yeah, there are early discussions from Coleridge to Paul de Man on the machine-like character of language, right? So that the way in which language is organized at times around repetition, reproduction, I mean, these sorts of things. And if you think of that, then you could draw a line. I mean, that's the AI-generated text is using algorithms. It's using, it's learning. It's repeating but altering. And this is what writing and reading do, right? Reading repeats. I mean, you write something and your language is always citational. You're relying on language that either you learned or things that you read. Emerson has this great line. I don't know how well known Emerson is here, but he's known for his essay called Self-Reliance, where he says, insist on yourself, never imitate. But the essay is 98% quotation. And it begins with an epigraph that says, do not seek yourself outside yourself, which is already a quote. You know, so he has an essay called Quotation and Originality, which not too many people read because it goes against his idea of self-reliance, because they don't understand that it's entirely it's an entirely citational essay. He says in the Quotation and Originality text, all minds quote, every moment is the warp and woof of the past and the present. We quote not only books, but chairs, tables, customs, religions. The originals are not original. There would be a history to the archangels if we but knew it. Right? So it's an amazing thing about how, again, whatever we think we're inventing, whatever we think we're doing new, is based on what we inherit, right?
Yeah.
And this is a kind of machine-like citational structure that is absolutely internal to ChatGPT, AI, which are based on structures of repetition, reproduction, and okay, altering what it takes, but this is what we all do, right? You can't produce something singular without passing through what you inherit, right? So in some sense, I mean, I hadn't ever put it this way, but is that AI basically reveals the way we think, right? AI is actually unfolding as an allegory of the way in which we think. And I think that it can do a lot, but I don't think it can ever catch up with some of us. So.
Okay. So, yeah. Just a concluding question. In your opinion, and now in a moment of danger, as you have said, what do you think is at stake politically today regarding the production or reproduction and the use of photography? Just, some thoughts. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I mean, I suppose you're saying that in this moment, I mean, I guess it's a broader question in some sense, and I'll turn to photography, but it's a question of what it means to do political work in the present.
Yeah.
Right. And I think this is a huge, enormous question. I think that in the example that I gave earlier about the way in which technology can be used both to interrupt and fissure and so on, but also to consolidate, homogenize, and so on, I was marking a kind of structural danger, right? That when you enter that space of danger, which is the risk of complicity with the very thing you're going against, this is a structural complicity. It's always there as a possibility because we use a language that isn't just ours. So I think that for me, doing politics has everything to do with trying to transform the relations in which we live. So this is why I'm obsessed with thinking about relation. I think that you can't think the political domain without thinking about relation, which is to say the relation between subjects and objects, between cities and nations, between, I mean, you know, everything, between ourselves and other people. You can't, the political domain requires a thinking of relation. So photography is a mechanism of relation, right? I mean, it's the relation between the photographer and the subject, between the medium and the referent, between, again, all the motifs and lexicon and vocabulary and language of photography, between presence and absence, memory and forgetting, light and darkness, truth and fiction, so that photography itself is a medium for thinking about relation, right? And so I think that photography has the opportunity to become a means of acting politically in the way that we said, though, that it can either emancipate or it can reinforce the worst, right? So I think that, like all political action, photography, the mobilization of images and so on can move in different directions. So that, I think that we have to, I mean, there's so many things I could say about what we need to be doing. But again, nothing can be programmed, right? So I think that Benjamin says at one point, it's always a question of how you set the masses in motion, right? And then he says, or as Brecht says, the art of thinking politically is the art of thinking your thoughts in other people's heads. Emerson's version is, a revolution happens when your thought becomes the thought of someone else, right? So if you think about the way in which photography can be mobilized, to the extent that it can document, record, show, it's a question of what it shows, right? So in some way, what Benjamin liked, and this is the same thing that he says about translation, in the same way that the best translations for Benjamin are absolutely the most violent ones, because he thinks that translation is never about conveying meaning. It's about conveying the catastrophe of language, the monstrosity of language, the way in which when you translate something, what you experience is the foreignness of all language, including yours. So if you think about the photograph, this is kind of what the photograph does. You look at a photograph and all of a sudden you're engaging something that is different from you, that is taking you to another place, that is asking you to have a relation to something that you didn't necessarily witness, if it's coming from someone else. And so that it's asking you to exceed yourself. It's asking you to imagine something. I think that you can't think politically without imagination. I think you can't change things unless you can imagine a change. You have to imagine something different in order to be able to work toward it, right? And so I think that we're in a moment where, I mean, in the note that you sent me, that you were saying that I, at one point in the introduction to the Poulantzas lecture, I said that we're living in a moment where thinking, speaking, and acting are in danger, right? That they're being prohibited on several fronts. And I think that this is exactly why we have to think, speak, and act. And photography can be a means of doing that, because photography is a means of speaking and acting. It's in its muteness, as I said before, in its muteness, it speaks. And I think that it speaks in the way it invites us to engage it and read it. But what I was going to say is that in the same way that Benjamin thinks that the best translations are the most violent ones, he also thinks that the most amazing photographs are the most unfaithful ones. Because the unfaithful photograph tells you that photograph doesn't necessarily give you what's supposed to be before the camera. So it requires a labor of reading and interpretation, which is why I've spent so much of the last decades trying to develop models for reading historically in moments of danger. I think and now we're back to the literacy question. I think we have to learn how to read historically. We have to learn how to read really well, because the better readers we are, and we don't just read books, we read people, we read events, the better readers we are, the better chance we have of encountering, accepting, acknowledging a world that is wildly different from us. And I think that this is extremely important, to be able to imagine relations with things that are different from us, with peoples, with things. This is why I said very early on that for me, you can't think politics without thinking relation. And I think that what motivates me the most is my wish to change the relations in which we live. And the only thing I'll close with is Benjamin's work of art essay, which, as he's scanning the landscape and going through all these different terms that are being mobilized by National Socialism, what he's doing is he's trying to change your relation to the language that is being used by this regime. Because he thinks that if he can change your relation to these words, he can change much more than just your relations to these words. He can perhaps change the relations in which we live. You know, so that for him, what motivates him is also what motivates me. And I think that photography has a role to play in this, not simply as a technology, but as I say, as a kind of lever that can open up a whole series of questions. Because that's, for me, photography is never just about photography, right? In other words, if I can read a tree and say that a tree, because the light goes through the leaves and it casts a shadow on the ground, so the tree itself is a photographic medium that produces images. If I can say that a tree can have a photographic dimension, if I can say that a corpse has a photographic dimension, if the stars have a photographic dimension, then maybe we don't yet know what a photograph is. And I think this is extremely important, because I think that we too often presume that we know something. And this is where the danger comes, right? So that in some way, we gain the right to read things precisely because we always act with tears in our eyes.
Yeah. Oh, it was an honor and pleasure having you here with us.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much,
Yes,
Eduardo.
okay, thank you. Thank you.